There are always blind sides to history. And what I mean by that is that the people that are writing history often assume certain things about that history and allow certain narratives to persist. For example, in various moments in American history, there's often this prevailing notion that the North, as opposed to the South, is a more benevolent place when considering human rights and civil rights. That's not always the case, as we see in this chapter of the city of New York's history. As we proceed into the 19th century, we'll begin to start talking about this manifestation called Jim Crow, which is associated with a power dynamic of white supremacy and the suppression of black citizenship. And for a long time, historians have only talked about Jim Crow as it relates to the South, when in fact the very idea and name of Jim Crow is a New York City creation. Jim Crow, as this theater advertisement kind of depicts, is a theater character developed by Thomas Rice, and it is a black minstrel theater character. That is a white actor donning blackface and black makeup and performing the exacerbated stereotypes of African Americans in the 19th century. And so the story of Jim Crow doesn't really begin in the South, but really begins in New York City and the ties between New York City and the South. And as we saw with the American Revolution, the Civil War in New York City was also a highly contested subject. It was also based on racial dynamics in the city at that time. So some of the questions that we'll be asking in this lecture are, what made New Yorkers so ambivalent about slavery in the first place? How did opinions about slavery differ based on class? How did these attitudes shape New York after the Civil War? How did New Yorkers resist slavery? And finally, what sparked the 1863 draft riots? Some of the key terms and concepts we'll be going into in this lecture are, for example, Metropolitan Dixiecrats. Another concept is Black Birders, as well as the New York Kidnapping Club and the draft riots themselves from 1863. As we have already discussed, the foundation of New York's economy and even the built urban environment really rests on slave labor that goes back to the early Dutch colonization of this area of the country. But as we come into the 19th century, however, we start to see the gradual erasure of the institution of slavery, at least as it pertains to New York. So as early as 1799, the New York State Senate passed an act that issued the gradual manumission of enslaved people in the state of New York. But some of the stipulations to this act were that it would free enslaved children who were born after the 4th of July on 1799. In 1817, another piece of legislation was passed in the New York State Senate, which freed enslaved people who were born after 1799, but not until 1827, which meant that they had to continue their process and their status as indentured servants, if not enslaved people altogether. Despite the limitations of these pieces of legislation, this nonetheless pushed us forward towards a path of complete abolition of slavery in the state of New York. By the 1830 census, there were only about 75 enslaved people living within the geographical boundaries of what by then was New York. And so by 1840, there were virtually no enslaved people, at least according to the census. But these pieces of legislation and these statistics in no way erase this long history of slavery, which in large part contributed to the rise of what became New York City. For example, like any other major port city in the North American continent, New York was a base of the slave trade. On the very left of this screen, you can see the Slave Auction House, built in 1715. It was an open-air building at the foot of Wall Street. Coincidentally, it's the same place that George Washington landed as they were escaping with the Continental troops from Fort Greene. As slavery was slowly abolished in New York State, this same auction house became the auction house for other commodities by that time as well. The auction house itself was the site of many horrific incidences of inhumane conditions for enslaved people. There are well-documented incidences of families being ripped apart literally and sold piecemeal to slavers. Scenes that many would associate immediately with the southern plantation states. But of course, this is not the South. This is New York. And the abolition of slavery itself was a hotly contested subject within the state of New York. And part of this was due to the very close relationships that merchants in New York enjoyed with southern plantation owners in the way they would barter not only enslaved people, but also commodities, agricultural commodities such as cotton, indigo, rice, among others. As slavery began this slow process of abolition into the 19th century, New York and other northern states became sites of refuge and key nodal points on what became known as the Underground Railroad, that system of support for runaway enslaved people. Upstate New York particularly became a hotbed of abolitionism and activism towards abolishing enslavement. As a consequence of being a refuge for runaway enslaved people through the beginning of the 19th century, New York consequently also became the primary location for slave hunters as well. According to the Federal Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, anyone claiming that a person residing in the North was a runaway from the South had only to appear before a local magistrate or personally represented by counsel and submit proof of their ownership of this person. And then they had legal grounds to take this person into custody and bring them back into the South. Within the protections of this Fugitive Slave Act, a group of slave hunters known as blackbirders, stalkers who were not above seizing blacks and shipping them into slavery, began prowling the city on a regular basis. Whether the subject had been enslaved and was subsequently free or not, these blackbirders would essentially take people into custody randomly and send them back into slavery in the South. In 1819, for example, 40 black people on Barclay Street tried and failed to rescue a man being taken by a slave catcher and a city marshal to Hudson River Steamboat Dock. In 1826, blacks bombarded a slaver, giving evidence at City Hall with bricks, sticks, and stones. But they were suppressed by police and were given severe sentences of long terms in jail. And so in this way, the New York metropolitan government supported this institution of blackbirders, or kidnapping as it came to be known. By the 1830s, bounty hunting of ex-enslaved people became a big business in New York City. One lawyer, for example, offered a search and return of runaway enslaved people for $250 a head. Ultimately, these bounty hunters formed a loosely knit association that came to be known as the New York Kidnapping Club. So, straight-up kidnapping was, of course, illegal, but if blackbirders brought a captive before the city recorder or any kind of magistrate and otherwise paid a witness to swear he or she was a recent runaway, the city of New York usually authorized this deportation. Again, the Metropolitan Authority essentially sanctioned this kidnapping. By this point in its history, New York City had a sullied reputation for human rights. Many people within the city were even ambivalent about slavery altogether. There was even a strong contingent of Democrats within the city that supported slavery and expressed an affinity with the slave-owning South. Whatever their private views about the Southern social order, the city's key economic actors, including ship owners who hauled cotton, the bankers who accepted slavery property as collateral for loans, the brokers of Southern Railroad and state bonds, the wholesalers who sent goods to the South, and even the editors who sent Southern subscription bases, the dealers in cotton, rice, and tobacco, all had a profitable income from the slave economy. Even as slavery was slowly being abolished through state acts, an illegal slave trade emerged within the city. From January 1859 to August 1860, nearly 100 vessels left New York Harbor on the slave trade business. Many had been even built here. The profits could be actually quite enormous. Transactions were often carried out overseas through Cuban go-betweens or captains who sometimes used Spanish or Portuguese crews to disguise their nefarious business. There is little discrepancy in terms of class on this view and the support of slavery. Like the businessmen and merchants, working-class people believed that New York's economy, and thus their jobs, depended on the Southern connection and the institution of slavery. In the 1859 mayoral election, Tammany Hall put forth Fernando Wood as their candidate. A strong representation of working class and immigrant populations in the city, Tammany Hall was a good indication of the political sympathies of these social groups. "The South is our best customer," Fernando Wood declared in 1859. "She pays the best prices and pays promptly." The economic ties between New York and the slave-owning South was even reflected in the cultural production of the early 19th century. The national anthem of the South at the time, a song called "I Wish I Were in the Land of Dixie," actually was written and first performed in New York City theaters. But nothing was more of an abomination to black civil rights in New York than the very institution of blackface minstrelsy. Indeed, the name Jim Crow comes out of this theatrical tradition of white performers donning black makeup and performing the stereotypes, the perceived discriminatory stereotypes of black people at that time. These dehumanizing depictions added insult to slavery. These dehumanizing depictions of humanity, black humanity, even further exacerbated New York's ties to slavery. As I mentioned earlier, however, this is not the complete story, that there is a resistance to slavery within New York. And part of that resistance has to do with the extant free black communities throughout the city, but also has to do with the nodes of activism and support that came to be known as the Underground Railroad. In Brooklyn, for example, the Bridge Street Methodist Episcopal Church became a major underground station, eventually providing refuge, food, and clothing for hundreds and hundreds of escaped enslaved people. Just as in the American Revolution, when Civil War broke out, New York was far from being a united front against the Confederacy. The New York draft riots of 1863 is an important chapter in New York City history that builds on the racism and the connections to the South that we've talked about before this lecture, and lays a foundation for New York's ambivalent stance on civil rights going forward. In March 1863, Congress passed the National Conscription Law, which essentially instituted a mandatory draft lottery to fill the ranks of the fallen Union soldiers up to that point. In New York, the draft lottery began on July 11th, 1863, and 2 days later, an enormous riot broke out in which firemen for the Fire Engine Company No. 33 broke up the lottery offices and smashed the poll booths. At this moment, New York City was essentially a lawless place. In July 1863, just a few days before the lottery had put in place, Robert E. Lee with the Confederate Army started to invade Pennsylvania. And in response, the governor of New York, Horatio Seymour, sent more than 20,000 troops to block Lee at Gettysburg, leaving no troops in New York City to defend against insurrections within the city. And within this draft riot that ensued was also a kind of race riot as well. By July 14th, there was a widespread hunt for black Americans that ensued throughout the city. Those who were caught were beaten, murdered, and mutilated, their bodies left on display. The draft riots also caused a fierce revulsion against the Irish immigrants, who were prominent in the violence as well. Court records from the time reveal that the rioters tended to be, quote, respectable people with jobs and settled homes, a fair cross-section of New York's younger male working class. But the attacks on police and African Americans soon expanded into opportunistic and arbitrary targets. The homes of rich and shops which sold to the poor were looted. Saloons and brothels were also attacked, and much liquor was stolen that fueled the violence and the agitation within the city at that time. In a letter to the editor of the Nation magazine, urban planner and and architect Frederick Law Olmsted, famous by that point for creating Central Park, said, "I think you should take the ground that the most dangerous foes of the Republic are in New York City, not in the South. That the government has now the right and the duty to put them down, that from the moment to the end of the war, government should deal with New York and other insurrectionary towns and districts as it does with Baltimore and Nashville and New Orleans. That is to say, to treat New York as if it were part of the South, as a part of the Confederacy." And looking back on the history of the ties between New York and the slave-owning South, that would make a lot of sense. This isn't the last time that we'll see racial violence in New York City, but rather this chapter in the city's history sets a stage and a precedent for ambivalence towards civil rights, particularly along the lines of race and gender going forward. So for this lecture, some key questions to keep in mind are: what made New Yorkers so ambivalent about slavery in the beginning? How did opinions about slavery differ based on class? How did these attitudes shape society in New York after the Civil War? How did New Yorkers resist slavery, and what sparked the 1863 draft riots? You'll need to know what are Dixiecrats, Metropolitan Dixiecrats, Blackbirders, the New York Kidnapping Club, and of course the draft riots themselves.